Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, I'm Dominic, and welcome to episode 32 of Divine Poetry. So you can see today that I am coming to you today from the eternal city of Rome. Our family took a trip over to Rome. I want to show my boys all of the glorious heritage of our Catholic past, and what better place to do that in than in Rome. So enjoy the background while I start today's video. Actually, I'm just kidding. I bought a green screen a couple years ago, and I like to play around with it. I'm actually still in my living room. Okay, anyway, in today's video, I want to talk about the parallels between the Roman-Jewish war from 66 to 70 AD and its parallels with the conflict in Gaza right now between Israel and Gaza. I did a YouTube video on this, so I am going to play part of that YouTube video in today's episode because I don't want to reinvent the wheel and just, do all that over again. But let me do some introductory explanations first to describe what you're going to see and set up some of the characters here. But before I do, real quickly, I announced in my last video that I have a new book coming out in probably mid-October to late October. It's the first book in my series of hopefully 10 books on Catholic historical fiction that's going to span the entire history of the Catholic Church. And I want to focus on the papacy in these books to give the children some practical, experiential kind of like understanding through reading, of course, about the papacy, what the papacy taught about itself, and how the true church, the true Catholics view the papacy, so that they are ready to reject the arguments of R&R if they ever encounter them later in life. But also, I want to make it action-packed. So the first book is set in the early church, and I'll just leave it at that. Also, by the way, yes, of course, I have an illustrator, a spectacular artist, Andrea England, who has agreed to illustrate the book. She's going to make the cover and various illustrations throughout. So look for that in mid to late October, hopefully. Okay, so in this conflict between the Jews and Rome from 66 to 70 AD, that conflict was really kind of nested inside of the greater set of events in the Roman Empire, starting with Nero and ending with the end of the year of 4 emperors. So, yeah, that period in Rome greatly affected the Roman-Jewish war as they interplayed between each other. And in like manner, the parallels for that are going to be also similarly related. In American politics now, I believe, and I've been waiting for, and I hope it should start soon, if it hasn't already started, the year of 4 presidents, which would obviously parallel the year of 4 emperors. I've did prior episodes of Divine Poetry where I've shown the correlations between Trump and Biden and Nero, and how also the Great Fire of Rome in 64 was a lot like the COVID disaster or whatever that was from 2002 to about 2022, around in there. So I'm tracing all these events in Rome and America, and also now tracing the events between Israel and Hamas and the greater Palestinian population with the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD against the Roman Empire. Now, I'll explain this in the video segment, which I'll play soon, but the greater set of parallels between the Jews and the early Christians after the resurrection of Christ would be akin to traditional Catholics and the Novus Ordo. And I'll explain that in the video. So this happens a lot, and I always find it difficult to explain because it's simple overall, but it's complex when you get into the details, is that the parallels seem to manifest in various ways, sometimes like in sub-tiers or like a class B kind of parallel. And so that's what I believe we're going to see here with Hamas and Israel. Nonetheless, I'll explain later on, though, that I do think that I believe the imminent fall of the Vatican is going to be related to this war because the parallels all intertwine. It's a masterpiece of divine poetry, right? So it's poetry more than science. It's artwork more than mathematics. It's I'll just kind of leave it at that. That's why I named it that, because I never can explain it. So I just kind of took the easy way out and said poetry. Okay, now there's some main characters in the Roman world. All right, we covered a lot in prior videos. There's Nero, obviously a lot is said about him, and then Vespasian. Vespasian was the last of the four emperors. He's the one that came out on top. But before that, he was like a common sense, like, salt of the earth kind of man. He liked the old Roman way of life. He clung to the old Rome. Nero represented the new, what's the word I'm looking for? Distorted, perverted Rome. All right, so Vespasian was the kind of Roman soldier that you would find in the earlier days of the Republic. He was one of Nero's top generals, but then, so Nero was on one of his famous art and fantasy tours in Greece, and he was giving some long play or some long song, and all the Romans had to pretend like Nero was amazing or they'd be killed. Well, Vespasian fell asleep during the performance. Now, Nero normally would have killed someone like that, but Vespasian was such a valuable Roman general who actually knew what he was doing that he just banished him instead. Right? But when the Roman war started up, he had to call Vespasian back to lead the war because he needed his expertise. Now, another person in this Roman story there's a lot of people, but that I'll point to is a fellow named Gessius Florus. He was like the governor of Roman Judea, and he was very imprudent. He marched into the Jewish temple, which is kind of like shaking the bee's hive, That was the Jews' one sacred space. Now, granted, this was after Christ, so the temple was now defunct. It was no longer God's house. But of course, the Jews believed it was still God's house. So that's the point, right? The Jews thought so. And so Gessius Florus walked into the temple, which was a disgrace or a sacrilege as far as the Jews were concerned. Now, in our time, right, we have parallels for Nero and Vespasian and Gessius Florus. And I'm going to focus primarily on what's happening in Israel. Now, I do think that like these parallels are like nesting dolls in that they'll exist in one locality, centralized, but then on a greater global scale, you can see them again. So if you want to look on a global scale, you're going to say that Biden and Trump are like Nero, okay? And that there's another Vespasian character, which I guess is yet to be defined on a global scale. And then on that same global scale, Netanyahu, which is the current prime minister of Israel, he would be like a Gessius Florus character, maybe a Vespasian character. Now, though, I want to disregard those global parallels for a second. I want to focus on Israel, right? In that context, sorry if this is confusing, but this is the advanced class, I guess, maybe I could say that. And in the specific region of Israel and Hamas parallels, it's more like Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister of Israel. He is more like a Nero character. He's despised by the elites, and he's loved by the conservatives over there. That's a lot like Nero was. Except Nero wasn't conservative, but nonetheless. And so he has a war minister named Yoav Gallant, who acted a lot like Vespasian, as you'll see in this upcoming clip. And then also there's another character here. The third one is Idmin Ben Gavir. He's a lot like Gessius Florus. He's marched into the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Temple Mount many times when the Palestinians and the Muslims have a written agreement that was signed way back in the, 50s or 60s or 70s. That says that the Jews were not allowed to go there and pray. Well, Idmin Ben Gavir is shaking the hornet's nest, just like Gessius Florus did, by marching in there constantly under armed guard. So the Palestinians have to watch as their quote, it's not sacred, but in their mind it's holy, right? As their quote holy site is also profaned in their eyes. So, by the way, I should mention that in this set of parallels with Hamas and Israel, it's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which would serve as the parallel for the Jewish temple. All right, and ironically or amazingly, not a coincidence, of course, is that the Jews say that the Al-Aqsa Mosque is sitting on top of the ruins of the first and second Jewish temple. And Idmin Ben Gavir, he's one of these types of Israeli politicians who's very religious, and he wants to rebuild the temple. All right, I'll get into that in a little bit. So those are the characters. You're going to hear about them in the video, but I just want to identify them beforehand. All right, let's see here. I guess I covered everything. So let me just go ahead and play the video clip right now, and then we'll do some commentary afterwards. Just as the Jews rejected Christ and lost their status as God's chosen people, so did the inverse happen in church history to those Catholics who accepted Vatican II. Christ established a new priesthood, a new sacrifice, the Holy Mass, a new hierarchy, a new doctrine. In a similar but inverse way, Antichrist did the same at Vatican II. There is a new false sacrifice, a new hierarchy, new invalid sacramental rites, new teachings, and a new hierarchy of non-Catholics in the Vatican. To continue with this logic, we can see that in the time of the apostles, the early Christians coexisted with the Old Testament religious system, which still had a temple and followed Old Testament laws and practices, after having rejected our Lord as the Messiah. That changed dramatically in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple. Traditional Catholics likewise are coexisting with the Novus Ordo Vatican system, which by comparison awaits the same end as the Jewish temple. It would seem that the Vatican will be destroyed both politically and financially, and perhaps even physically, just like Jerusalem and the temple were. Before I start, I want to clarify that the main parallel for the Jews after the coming of Christ is the Vatican and the Novus Ordo. However, there also appears to be another clear manifestation in the natural order for these parallels, which proves easy to see and to grasp. And that is the parallel between the Romans and the Jews in 70 AD and the Palestinians and the nation of Israel now. In this video, I want to demonstrate these parallels with more evidence and clarity. Unfortunately, the current events that seem to be so clearly prefigured involve this tragic war in Gaza. I will document them in this video and also make some predictions about what will happen next in the conflict in Gaza. So let me explain. Ironically and amazingly, the modern state of Israel is playing the role of the Romans, and the Palestinians are playing the role of the Jews. What is happening now between Israel and the Palestinians is like the great Jewish revolt against the Romans from 68 to 70 AD, which ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So this is a big deal. Let me show you some of the parallels that I have observed so far, and afterwards I will lay out some predictions of events to come in this conflict, based on what happened between the Romans and the Jews in 70 AD. One of the key events that sparked the Jewish revolt was the ambush and slaughter of an entire Roman legion at Beth Horon in 66 AD. The Jews captured the prized Roman eagle, which was the symbol of the Roman legion. This was a huge insult to the Roman Empire. The Jews also collected a lot of military equipment from the defeated legion. Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote that this attack at Beth Horon happened after the Feast of Tabernacles that year, which usually ends around late September or early October. In a similar way, the Great Revolt of Hamas against Israel began on October 7th, when Hamas surprised the Israelis and took hundreds of hostages, which was a huge affront to Israel. Hamas also raided some military buildings and took supplies and hardware back to Gaza. Interestingly, the Feast of Tabernacles ended on October 6th, 2023. So in both cases, the ambush that started the war occurred just after the Feast of Tabernacles. The next event that followed in the Roman-Jewish War was the massive invasion of the northern Jewish region of Galilee by the Romans. The Romans had been caught off guard by the Jews at Beth Horon and wanted to terrorize and demoralize them by devastating the north with brutality. Josephus was a Jewish commander in one of those northern cities of Geopolitical. He famously predicted that the siege of Geopolitical would last 47 days, which it did. The Roman general Vespasian heard of this prediction and was impressed by Josephus. We will come back to Josephus later because he's very important in this story. The Israelis also felt humiliated and caught off guard by the October 7th attack by Hamas. They took some time to gather their ground forces and invaded the Gaza Strip, starting with northern Gaza. The Israeli Air Force bombed northern Gaza brutally and relentlessly in a shock and awe campaign that seemed to be driven by revenge, rage, and a desire to demoralize the Palestinians. The siege of northern Gaza lasted 47 days, until a ceasefire was announced. The ceasefire lasted 7 days, at which time the Israeli army resumed their push into the southern part of the Gaza Strip. In the northern territory of Galilee, the Jews were led by the Zealots, who were a group of Jews that wanted to fight the Romans and had no problem dying for their cause. The Zealots were very militaristic and were fiery and determined, convinced that God was on their side. However, in Jerusalem, the Jews were led by the Sadducees, who were more moderate and wanted to make some kind of deal with the Romans to coexist with them. The Palestinians are also divided in a similar way. In Gaza, the people are or were governed by Hamas, who are like the Zealots, who want conflict and war with the Israelis. They are religiously convinced of their cause and have no problem dying in the fight. They are fiery and very determined, just like the Zealots. In the West Bank, which is the other enclave of the Palestinian population, they are ruled by the PA, or the Palestinian Authority. They are moderates and want to find a way to make a deal with Israel and coexist with them, since they know they cannot match Israel's military and economic strength. One of the features of the Roman siege of the northern Galilean stronghold of Geopolitical was the network of tunnels under the city and the surrounding area. The Jews, led by Josephus, used these tunnels to store weapons and supplies and to hide themselves when the Romans breached the defenses and entered the city. Josephus and about 40 other Jewish leaders were hiding in these underground labyrinths while the Romans searched for them throughout the city of Geopolitical. They knew that Josephus, the commander of the northern Jewish forces, was somewhere in there, and they really wanted to find him. Hamas has also dug an extensive network of underground tunnels under Gaza. They use them to move around the Gaza Strip as a military tactic, but also use them as a command center, a storage place, and probably a hiding place for the hostages who they took on October 7th. It is now mid-December, and the Israelis are looking for the leader of the Hamas forces in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar. He is thought to still be hiding in the tunnel system. Israel has almost finished its operations above ground in the Gaza Strip, and they are starting to flood the tunnels with seawater to flush out any Hamas operatives that are still in there. The Roman Emperor Nero, who was increasingly unpopular among the Roman elites, chose General Vespasian to lead the war against the Jews. This was significant because Vespasian had been exiled by Nero for displeasing him. Vespasian fell asleep during one of Nero's long theatrical performances. However, Nero knew that Vespasian was a skilled general and brought him back from exile. Vespasian would eventually become emperor after the year of 4 emperors in Rome was over. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also increasingly unpopular among the Israelis and has faced immense pressure to step down before this war started. He had fired the former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant because he criticized Netanyahu's very unpopular attempts to reform the government in Israel. Amazingly, Yoav Gallant passed out during one of Netanyahu's long theatrical political speeches in the Israeli parliament. However, Netanyahu reinstated Gallant to his office, and he is now leading the war against Hamas as the Israeli defense minister. Yoav Gallant is speculated to have ambitions to replace Netanyahu as prime minister one day.
All right, so we can see that the launch off, the start of this conflict, at least in the immediate conflict, can be traced back to the, October 7th attack of Hamas on Israel, and how that is the same Jewish calendar date as the Battle of Beth Horon, when the Jews did the same thing to the Romans. It's ironic that the Romans, who the Jews fought in 70 AD, have switched now. Now it's the Jews playing the role as the Romans. It's divinely poetic. It's amazing. So you see the parallels with the launch of the war. You see the parallels with the different factions of Palestinians, the different factions of the Jews during the war. You also see the tunnel systems that both had. You also see what else was in that video? Oh yeah, so Yoav Gallant and Vespasian. So a lot of parallels. The 47 days is amazing as well. Now let me go in through and touch on some things that I didn't mention in the video. So at one point during the Jewish-Roman War in 66 to 70 AD, the Jews launched out onto the sea for the first time in their history, and they disrupted grain flows going into Rome from Alexandria. So Rome was largely dependent on the grain from the Nile River Delta region. There was it could produce a lot of grain, and Rome used that grain to kind of supply and feed its citizenry in Rome. And so now Israel also is very similar. It can't produce all that it needs. Israel is not self-sufficient in terms of goods It has to import a lot of those goods from overseas. And one of the main trade routes is through that Suez Canal. And of course, we know in the news, in the last year or so, maybe even a couple last weeks, we have the Houthis, who are a Muslim group aligned with Hamas, and they have been disrupting shipments into Israel as well. In fact, they supposedly, at one point, they were only attacking vessels that were bound for Israel. So there's a clear parallel with the Jews of the Roman Jewish War. That's amazing. Now let's see here. We're just going to touch about. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque is very interesting as well, because at the end of the Jewish-Roman War, of course, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Now, if that Al-Aqsa Mosque is targeted by the religious Jews right now, like Idam Ben Gvir and a fellow named Smoltrich, if they're targeting that mosque in various interviews they've done in Israeli media, they want to rebuild that third temple. In fact, many of you probably are aware that the Temple Mount organization is ready with all of the instruments they need to start up the sacrifices in the temple again. They even have the red heifers that they've imported from Texas. I'll put the headlines on the screen. And reportedly, they're somewhere near Mount Olivet waiting for the time when that red heifer can be sacrificed and then burnt and its ashes sprinkled on the priest to purify the priest for sacrifice again. It's part of the old Mosaic law. There were 9 red heifers in the course of the Old Testament, and I guess this 10th red heifer is very important. I'm not aware of all the details of that, but my point is that so the temple system is ready to go, and they're ready to rebuild that temple. Now, I know that there's a ton of end times prophecies and expectations about the Antichrist that involve that third temple. Wouldn't it be interesting? Of course, many of you are aware, maybe you're not, that I hold the position, and I wrote a book on it called Vatican II and Antichrist, that the actual reign of Antichrist happened at Vatican II. So I think the Antichrist is actually behind us, and we're just waiting for the destruction of the Vatican to fulfill all prophecy and be the end of the world. And I think we're very close to that. And I think these parallels with the Roman Jewish War have a lot to do with that. I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but I'm guessing that somehow the Vatican will be dissolved politically, somehow related to this conflict. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong, but somehow it'll have to be dissolved, because the Vatican is to Catholics as the temple was to the Jews and early Christians, right? The temple was God's house until the coming of Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, and then it ceased to be so, just like how the Vatican used to be the house of God in the center of the Catholic Church until Vatican II, and it became apostate, and Catholics no longer lived there, just in parallel with the temple. But nonetheless, though, if the temple, if the Al-Aqsa Mosque is destroyed at the end of this conflict somehow, and if we have a Vespasian character coming at the year of 4 presidents, who's going to save the Western world from what looks like a collapse, right? That's going to look just like the Antichrist, right? You're going to have someone who saves the world from collapse and destruction. Everyone's going to hail him as a savior. And then this third temple is going to be announced over in Israel. And everyone's going to think, this looks like the Antichrist. But I will still hold that position that actually no, right? The Antichrist happened at Vatican II. So this really does seem to be like this masterpiece of parallel and prophecy that is going to be like this grand finale towards the end of the world. So, this is just my guess, right? But I'm just kind of extrapolating from the parallels that have already happened so far and projecting them into the future and making a logical conclusion. It could be wrong, right? But it's logical. It's based on empirical evidence in terms of prophecies and parallels that I've established through books that I've written already. So let's see here. Okay, the one key figure that I'm still waiting for, is Josephus. So in the Roman Jewish War, Josephus was the leader of the Galilean forces, and Vespasian went through and he violently and with extreme harshness and severity, he slaughtered Galilee. So much bloodshed was going on. And then there was the city of Iotapata that Josephus was commander of. And at the end of that battle, Galilee was finally subdued. And it does seem that Gaza is like that now. We have We've all seen the pictures, or maybe you haven't because you've been wisely ignoring the news. But there's that kind of level of carnage going on in Gaza right now. And there's one leader, Yahya Sinwar, who has been hiding in the tunnels, and is reportedly still in the tunnels, surrounded by hostages. That's what happened with Josephus. He was hiding at the end of the conflict. He ended up hiding in the labyrinth system under Yodapada, and he had 40 of his comrades with him. There were no hostages, but there were still a large amount of people under the ground with Josephus. So it would seem to me that Yahya Sinwar might play the role as Josephus. Maybe I'm wrong. Someone's going to, right? The value of Josephus to the Romans was that he kind of whitewashed their campaign. The Romans knew that their campaign looked brutal and kind of like heavy-handed. So Josephus came and he defected. He basically defected to the Romans, and he provided a plausible story of why the Romans were doing this, but he still maintained a lot of his outrage against what Rome was doing. But he kind of softened it and blunted it a little bit. It was a PR move by the Romans. It was kind of brilliant, right? So Josephus even denied that the Romans destroyed the temple on purpose, which is what would have to happen if Israel were to destroy that Al-Aqsa Mosque. In this world we live in of religious indifferentism, it'd be very hard for Israel to justify the intentional destruction of the mosque. But if you could have someone from the Palestinian side kind of say like, oh, the Israel's bad, of course they're bad, but they didn't do it on purpose, right? That's basically what Josephus did. And I would expect something similar to happen in our time, because Israel would need something to maintain the position of the high moral ground, the high moral ground of what they would do with the mosque. So, of course, we'll see how it plays out. But anyway, there you go. There are the parallels that, as I see them, between the Israel-Hamas conflict and the Roman-Jewish war, and also how they relate to the Year of Four Emperors, and hopefully they'll relate, or possibly they'll relate to the Year of Four Presidents, which should be upcoming very soon. I'm guessing around this election. Okay, glory be to God and Ave Maria, and I'll see you next week.